So I'm Audrey Timm. I'm a technical advisor to the International Association of Horticultural Producers. I'll be leading the session and moderating the question and answer session. So as I said, these are the City of London Green City Briefings. This is the 7th session for this year. We're running 8 through the year, so the next one in December is the last for the series. The briefings were initiated by the Worshipful Company of Gardeners, which is a historic heritage company based in the City of London, and they promote science and practice of greening and making London a better and prettier place to live. We're holding them in collaboration with the City of London, and the topics for the sessions are really aligned with the City of London climate action strategy, but they're broadly applicable to cities around the world. And so we welcome to this session, as we have to other sessions, people from around the world. And we hope that you will be able to learn something here to take back to your own country and your own city. So quick housekeeping, we are taking questions from the audience. If you could put your questions in the chat function, we'll include those in the Q&A session that we're having after the two speakers have presented. I work with International Association of Horticultural Producers. I am their technical advisor. I lead many programs in AIPH, but the one that's relevant to the Green City Briefings is that I lead the Green City program. And through this program, we use knowledge exchange, networking, and advocacy to increase not just the quantity, but the quality of greening in urban environments, positioning the many benefits that they bring, from solving some of the urban problems to making cities better and happier places for people to live in, delivering a sense of cultural connection and really inspiring people to bring more plants into their lives, whether it's in their home, their office, their gardens, or in and around their cities. And these briefings and what we do in the AIPH is targeted at everyone from a home garden through to mayors, city leaders, and decision makers, landscape designers. So the topic of the session, we're looking at the real and realistic benefits of plants. There's a lot of conversation around the world about the importance of plants and what they bring, but it really is quite important not just to think of plants as green things. We think of them as individuals that can deliver specific benefits. And they can deliver specific benefits that can address some of the problems for climate change, which is very much a focus of this. Climate mitigation is a big topic, and that certainly requires reducing emissions, energy efficiency. Running alongside climate mitigation, we have to address climate change adaptation, which is about making our environment a better place while the mitigation takes place. And plants play a central role in this, but we need to be very clever about what we think about plants and where we place them. The speaker initially was going to be speaking about air quality specifically, was Professor Paul Monks, who chaired the DEFRA report on the impacts of vegetation on urban air quality. And this is a really insightful report that directs policy and suggests that while plants can have a very local response to improving air quality, they're not the answer for citywide scale reducing air pollution. And the way that they can reduce local air pollution depends very much on plant selection, but also very much on how they're placed and how they're managed. And the report is very useful in that, and I'll put the link in the chat to it in a moment. So Professor Monks has gone to COP26 to hopefully make an important difference there. But we're looking at plants and their role and how they can create realistic change. So our two speakers today are very much focused around that, around the research around plants, what we know, what we find out, how we put that into practice, and how that practice informs policy to really make a difference on a local, citywide, and global scale. So our first speaker today is Dr Henrik Sjöman. Henrik divides his time between researching and teaching at the Swedish University of Agricultural Science in the Department of Landscape, Architecture, Planning and Management in Alnarp. And he contributes to the Gothenburg Botanical Garden and the Gothenburg Global Biodiversity Centre in Sweden. Henrik's work is mainly focused on developing knowledge of site-adapted plant use for urban environments, how the capacity of different trees will vary in context to its urban environment, and in delivering ecosystem services. This has become the prime driver in Henrik's work, and as such, how to extend the knowledge of diversifying the urban treescape. Finding plants for tomorrow means to combine traditional plant hunting of less common species with research and evaluation. And this leads to creating a diversified approach to a resilient urban forest. In today's session, Henrik will talk about urban tree diversity, what species to use, and how this knowledge aligns with policies, planning, and nursery production. Henrik, thank you very much for your time today. And please tell us all you know about trees.
All right, thank you very much for inviting me here. And I will start to share screen, and then we go from there. Let's see. Do everybody see a pink flower?
Yes, that's fine. We can see it.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you very much for inviting me and for the introduction. As was said, I'm working at both the Botanic Garden in Gothenburg and at the university in Alnarp there. And my main focus, depending on site, there is towards plant selection for mainly urban environment, but also towards how to use it for our future climate scenarios and ecosystem services and so on. And it's not only including trees, but this today is focused on the trees there. But I would like to start here because there is an ongoing revolution, or have been going on for a decade or two. Because when I started with gardening and when I started with the garden designing before I entered to the university, trees and greenery was one of the last objects into the planning process. You get invited very late in the process, and you get leftover areas to plant the trees or the plants in general, and they shouldn't cost anything. And everything was towards aesthetic, should look good, couldn't cost anything, look good. And what's happening now is what we didn't have for 15, 20 years ago. We have a completely different language when it comes to arguing why trees are important, why we should use trees there and not there, and why tree planting should cost. And what I'm talking about is, of course, this, the trees and ecosystem services, because today there is an enormous amount of evidence where we can use in order to argue why we should keep the old trees from not be felled, but also why we should plant more trees and why we should plant more trees. And this has changed the agenda completely, especially in, I think all around the world, because today you can see that tree people or plants people get invited a little bit earlier in the planning process, not enough early, but still you can see there is a differences. A lot of big cities around the world have increased the tree planting budget and so on. And today there is a lot of this evidence available, which we should and can use in order to argue of trees. But it's important to bear in mind, a lot of this ecosystem service, that's this just a figure I stole from a thesis presented a few years ago at the university, which I think sum up the complexity a trees and then green infrastructure can actually deliver. But what you have to bear in mind is that not all of them, a lot of these ecosystem services are connected to large and healthy trees. Don't have to be old trees, but large and healthy trees. Because it's not rocket science if you think about it. The bigger the trees are, the wider the tree crown are, and the denser the canopy are, the more shade can they do, the more wind can they reduce, more stormwater management that can they be part of in order to stop water to get to the ground through interception and so on. Which means that all of these old trees that we have in urban environment today are very, very important to keep healthy and large. But at the same time, the young trees we're planting today need to become these old and large trees. And by thinking about this, all these beautiful scenarios with trees, the living ecosystem services, and all this is based on tree selection or plant selection. Because if we fail in the very beginning by forcing trees into situations they have no idea how to develop and how to handle the growing condition on the site, well, the result will probably be like this. And this is not an uncommon view. This is from Sweden, but I think you have it in UK as well, where you force trees into situations where they have no idea how to handle it. And this particular picture here shows sycamore maple, which is one of the more moist demanding maples among the large growing species in the genera. And still, this is not a completely worthless planting pit because it structures soil and have a rather good growing condition underneath the pavement here. But still, it's too tough for this sycamore maple. And these trees will never ever become these healthy large trees and delivering all these important ecosystem services. Because these ecosystem services is not only important today, but will be very much important into the future when we're facing really severe challenges. And one more thing about this numbers, 25 to 40%. Studies or project which I have been part of, but also have been look at that 20 to 40% of the trees that have been planted in situations like this and didn't perform well and needs to be taken away will not be replaced by new trees. This means that tree planners, landscape architects, but seldom get a second chance when it comes to tree selection. And it's also not rocket science because there is a budget of planting trees, make them established, but it's not budget to replace trees that fail to develop good. So therefore, a lot of trees that will fail will not be replaced. Because think about all these trees that have been planted, taken away, that could and should have become this large trees to become to delivering all these ecosystem services. So for me, we have two main challenges when it comes to tree selection for urban environment. And these are, of course, developing knowledge and experience of different tree species capacity, delivering ecosystem services. And the second one, develop knowledge and experience of different tree species capacity for different growing habitats. I will come back to these later on, but there is one more third challenge, which is toughest one maybe, and that's the one where we have to develop knowledge towards a more untraditional plant materials. Because if you look at how tree diversity in urban environment looks today, you can see there is very uneven balance in the diversity between the species. You can see that from this study we actually done the same study twice, where we have collected tree data from the biggest cities in the Scandinavian region, where you can see, for example, in Helsinki, all public trees in both streets and park environment, 44% of the trees belongs to one species of lime tree, while the street environment in Oslo, Norway, belongs to 45% belongs to one species, in this case probably Europea. But this is not a Scandinavian problem. You can see it all around the world. This is an ongoing study where we compile tree inventories for all around the world. But here you can see Pittsburgh in US, Beijing, China, Camden in London, on Barcelona. Here you can see that it's the 3 to 4 genera that stands for half of the tree populations within these cities. And when you think about it, when you have this fragile diversity, if 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of these species will be attacked by a disease and genera, will result in enormous tree loss, which of course is a loss of trees delivering important ecosystem services. Since we don't know into the future what we will face when it comes to climate, urbanization, diseases, pests, and so on, we need to think diversity. But think about as many species and cultivars and genera as possible, because we can't afford to losing half of the tree population just by diseases on the 3 most common species there. But as I said, It's a very short talk, just 20 minutes here. So therefore, I'll forward a little bit. But I would like to go back to this question: developing knowledge and experience of different tree species' capacity for delivering ecosystem services. Because if you look at the trend today, this is a little bit of the trend we can see in the big cities around the world, where you have programs which promote themselves or brand themselves to plant as many trees as possible. It's 1 million, 20 million, 10 million tree projects all around the globe. And the idea to do that is, of course, the more trees, the more ecosystem service is going to be delivered. And this is, of course, good when it comes to the publicity, trees and tree planting, yes, and also the budget for tree planting. But I ask myself sometimes, when you're going to plant 1 million trees, do you also take creating 1 million really good planting pits? Do you have a really thoroughly establishment management or maintenance of the trees? And when you're going to plant 1 million trees, are you site specific when it comes to site condition that trees have to face, but also on that particular space, the trees, the ecosystem the trees have to deliver on just that spot? It's all these question part of this million tree project. I'm not sure, because what I think we need to move towards, because even if this project are really, really good, really important, we have to move away from this quantitative perspective when it comes to trees and tree plantings in urban environment, because it's not that simple. The more trees we're going to plant, the more ecosystem will show up. It's not that simple. I will show you some example from a recent project where we did this, where we come to evaluating trees for air pollution relief. And this is a new published paper we did recently. It's based on a study in Gothenburg, southwestern Sweden, where we have evaluated different parts of Gothenburg from the most polluted area in the city center. For example, Nils Eriksson's terminal, which is the main bus and train station in the city center, where the air is, rather polluted compared to other areas like in the Arboretum, where it's in the Botanic Garden, or in Angered, which is an outskirt of the city. So here can show it's a gradient when it comes to pollution. And within the study, we have these machines or filters that filter in the air. And then we compare these filters to the nearby growing trees to see how much of the particles in the air is actually stuck on the trees close to the filters. We can see how much of the air or how much of the pollution in the air actually gets stuck on the leaf. Because we know that big trees, filtering a lot of air, and within the air is a lot of particles that get stuck on the leaves and branches and so on. But we don't know so good about the quantity of the amount of pollution or the particle they can collect. At the same time also, are there any differences between the species? And these are some action pictures when we're collecting samples. On the left there is collecting leaf sample in the Arboretum at the Botanic Garden. And on the right there, we're collecting downtown in Gothenburg, collecting needles of the black pine, Pinus nigra. And the result from the study is, yes, trees can take up a lot of pollution, but there is differences between the species. And one difference we can see in the study is the area, the leaf area, the amount of area that the particle gets stuck on. And comparing in this study between oak and pine trees is that the pine tree have much higher level of leaf area compared to the oak trees. Even if the needles are very small and thin, the amount of area within the trees are much, much greater. So therefore, much more particles are connected to the pine tree. And if you think about that density, the amount of area of the leaves, I would like to give you an insight of a recently published study, actually published last night in a journal in the US called Plant and Wood Area Index of Solitary Trees in Urban Context in a Nordic City. In this study, we actually evaluated the density between different species and cultivars of trees. And in this, on the right side, you see a figure showing the variation of the density of branches and the leaf index compared to over 60 different species in general. So this is the stuff we need to move towards more into detail to see what will the trees on that side to deliver, what's the capacity? Because we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to get out of this tree planting? Just a nice autumn color, or also taking our particles? Then we also have to see which species to use in order to get the best capacity out of it. And this is just in the same study, you can see the variation within the same species, which is great. So this is the stuff we need to move towards, to focus more on quality rather than quantity, because it's not that simple. The more trees we're planting, the more ecosystem service we will get. And I think my time is up. Or do I have 5 more minutes? Because I'm not sure if I just continue then.
Yes, certainly. Carry on.
Okay, carry on. All right. The next one I would like to just give some insight is developing knowledge and experience of different trees with capacity for different growing conditions. Because a question we have to ask ourselves is, when we look at tree or look in books to find information of tree species capacity to take drought or heat or flooding and so on, the information is mainly towards the whole species as one. But what we not acknowledge enough, things we have to acknowledge in the future, is the variation within the species. The question for the future is, we already grow the best genetic materials of the species, and are these already in cultivation? Because this is a study we finished last year together with Harry Watkins, which is a director at St Andrews Botanic Garden in Scotland. And we evaluating the variation within different species, for example, just based on 2 factors, in this case, temperatures and precipitation. And then we took these and look at the climate and the sites this species grows naturally. This is Norway maple, Acer platoninus. And then you can see the variation depending on these 2 factors, where these species occur naturally. And also how different genotypes of the same species have adapted to different temperature and precipitation levels. So the question we have to ask ourselves, which of these green dots of the species are we growing today? The genetic materials. But this will be even more important in the future. Which of these green dots will we or have to grow into the future? Especially when you look at some other species, there is a fantastic variation within the species in order to tolerate warm or dry weather. This is the stuff we need to care about when we're facing more challenging urban environment, but also additional with changing climate. And this is some studies we also finished this year when we evaluated drought tolerance between different genetic materials within the same species. This is a birch, ordinary birch, Petula pendula, collected. This is data collected in a botanic garden in Liverpool, Nest Botanic Garden, where we evaluated the same species but different geographical background. They've been collecting all over the world where they grow naturally. And then you can see the variation. The lower minus, the more drought tolerant the cell structure of the leaves are and can take a drought much, much better. Here you can see the variation from -3, which is rather drought tolerant, to -2, which is rather sensitive. When it's come to urban environment, you can't say drought tolerant and birch. No, it depends. Another study, same focus, leaf structure, see the cell structures, capacity to take drought. So you can see variation between different tree collections. Look at the Tilia tomentosa, the silver line up there. We have enormous variation depending if there is a tree growing in Alma, Cornell University, Kew Garden, or Morton Arboretum in Chicago. This is the stuff we need to care about, the variation within the species. Are we growing actually the best genetic materials of the species, or is it still out there to be discovered? Because this is what we need to care about. And the last picture here, this is the red maple. Also, you can see the variation within the species when it comes to drought tolerance. So just things to think about for the future. Thank you very much.
Henrik, thank you very much. I love the t-shirt. I know you've been described as a tree geek. So yeah, trees, plants, that's excellent. Thank you, that is fascinating. We're very fortunate to get from you the most recent information about that. So really interesting. We'll go into a lot of questions for the Q&A, but really interesting. You started off sort of posing the problem, and that failure reduces confidence, and that budgets for greening only have budget for planting once. So if things fail, they don't get planted again. So that's really something to address, and your work certainly looks like it's giving us the information, the evidence to address that and reduce failures. But a lot more discussion about that in the Q&A. Thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is Dr. Tijana Blanusa, Principal Horticultural Scientist for the Royal Horticultural Society in England. Dr. Blanusa leads the RHS's Ecosystem Services Research Program, identifying the structural and functional traits of plants that can be isolated, optimized, and employed to benefit the wider environment. Her post is based at the University of Reading in the School of Agriculture, Policy and Development, where she teaches a Part 3 MSc module on green infrastructure and ecosystem services, and supervises undergraduates, masters, and PhD students from the University of Geneva. She is PMI certified project manager and biomimicry practitioner. Today, Tijana presents the science behind the knowledge of plants and their contribution to environmental issues. Her presentation outlines plant mechanisms and describes how this information can be used in practice to inform planting decisions in various contexts. I look forward to hearing about your research and its practical implications, Tijana. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, and thanks for inviting me to present a little bit of our work. So I will share the screen. Can you please let me know if you can see it?
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay.
Oh, good.
So can you also hear me reasonably well? I know there were some concerns in the audience about the breaking up of the sound.
Yes, I can hear you. I hope everyone else can.
Okay. So I have kind of composed this talk as a bit, well, in the hope that there will be a bit in it that kind of suits everyone. There are different elements of the story that I'll be touching on, and maybe not all of it will be relevant for everyone, but hopefully there will be a bit for everyone in it. So the context of my talk is very, very similar to Henrik's. It's I'm a plant physiologist. I'm interested in how differences in plant structure and function primarily can be put to use to benefit the urban environment. And here in this slide, you can see the list of the malaises, the issues that we are faced with in urban environment. And vegetation, we think, can certainly help mitigate some of these issues, but there are lots of ifs and buts. It's the extent of cover, how much we have of planting, which is something that Henrik alluded to as well. The choice of species is important, as we've also heard, and also how we manage what we have. The extent of management can radically influence the benefits or the end result. So what I am going to talk about is kind of try and tackle a little bit this story about plant differences in the extent of services provision. So we know as biologists that a plant A, if you will, could be hugely different in terms of how it looks and how it works from a plant Z. There's then a question of where that difference becomes relevant. Is it relevant just on a local scale? Does it have a broader impact on cities' microclimate? And those are the kinds of questions that I am trying to deal with in my research. I'm also, while most of my projects often focus on a single service, so I worked on, role of green roofs and air temperature regulation, green walls and relative humidity in the buildings, tree species and air pollution trapping. I think increasingly we need to begin to look at the provision of multiple services, because even though we may be in any particular moment just be interested in one service, those very same plants provide many simultaneous benefits. So that's something that I will also try and touch on in my talk. So over the last decade, I have worked in this area of plant ecosystem services, provision of regulating ecosystem services, primarily cooling, pollutant trapping, and flood mitigation. And basically the overall umbrella under which I work is this sort of statement that differences in plant structure and function lead to differences in the delivery of ecosystem services. And we have so far found evidence of that in the research we have conducted, but that was largely linked to a very local scale, so a single building scale or a local garden scale rather than a whole neighborhood or city scale. So to summarize the work that we have done so far, I have put up this slide, which links together work of my 3 PhD students over the last few years, Maddalena Vaz-Monteiro, who worked on cooling, and Sarah Kemp, who worked on rainfall capture, and Federica Fantozzi in Italy, who worked on pollutant trapping. And all of them were interested in trying to find which underlying plant traits can be linked to delivery of particular services, because we can't really survey every living species there is. I mean, RHS is Plant Finder, which is a well-liked and well-used resource here in the UK for choosing different species. It has 80,000 plus species and cultivars that people can choose available from British nurseries. But we are trying to figure out what characteristics in terms of function and structure the planting needs to have to deliver what we call maximum benefits. And there is debate could be had around what is a maximum benefit, but we're trying to see what the plant needs to have in order to deliver more, as it were. So for cooling, these are the kinds of things, high transpiration rate, light leaf color, presence of hairs, large leaf areas. So generally thirsty, physiologically active plants. Very similar traits are required for plants to capture rainfall in the canopies and also to pump out the water out of the soil and therefore reduce flooding risks. Again, high transpiration rate, presence of hairs, dense canopies, large leaf areas. And then some of these traits required for particulate pollutant trapping. And because Audrey asked me today to speak, focus more on pollution, I've selected a few examples of our more recent work as well that covers this area. So while perhaps, 10 or 20 years ago, discussion was very much and research was very much focused on which traits we need to, maximize pollution capture, we now understand that there is a lot more subtlety behind it. And generally the role of plants within air quality improvement story is cautioned by this context here, that plants really are only just the third line of a defense after reducing emissions and increasing distance from pollution sources. So whereas somewhere like cooling, plants can have quite a significant effect, when it comes to air pollution, much bigger effect would come from reducing the emissions and increasing the distance from the source. So the further away you are from traffic, obviously the air quality improves. But there is still a role for plants, and there is a role for plants differences. And here I've outlined the mechanisms of how plants work. They work through deposition, dispersion, and modification of pollution. And some over the last decade, there have been papers that have shown that largely on a local scale, we can see positive influence of planting on the air quality improvement. For example, work at University of Surrey has shown over several studies reduction in airborne particle concentration behind the hedge, so improvement of air quality behind the hedge. There's also arguments that vertical greening, green walls, reduce the extent of pollution for particles as well as gases. And then some of the work in my own lab has shown that plant species differ in the extent of pollution mitigation, along with other people's works as well. So the kind of where we are so far, I think, in knowing what plants do is, yes, they do help reduce aerial pollution. These are the features on the left that are helpful. So rough and hairy leaf surfaces attract and retain more particles. Large and open canopies provide good service. Evergreen plants generally provide better service because of their, year-long leafiness, and that this effect is proportional to the extent of greenery. So the impact of plants is quite local, and basically the more plants we have, the bigger impact. But things to bear in mind are that, we really need to think specifically about the situation. Some work over the last few years from the University of Birmingham has shown very clearly that, in narrow street canyons where we have tall buildings and narrow streets, we have to think probably more about vertical greening, building greening rather than trees, to avoid trapping of pollution underneath the canopies. We also need to learn a lot more about the role of stems, bark, and soil, and the whole dynamic, and what happens when the particles get washed off from streets. Most of our research says, yes, okay, more is being trapped, but what happens after they get washed? So it's I think the case of watch this space, but we already know more than we've known a decade ago. So here I'm going to move into the second part of the talk, where I'm sort of focusing on two sets of experiments on hedges. And the reason why we've undertaken these research projects on hedges is because in the urban context here in the UK, we know they're quite prevalent, that 40% plus of household owners who have domestic gardens have hedges. They're often used as barriers in the roads. They are a compact form of green infrastructure, which doesn't require a lot of space. They're linear, so therefore avoiding some of the issues that I've mentioned with trees in the previous slide. And they're reasonably cheap to implement as a potential solution. So one of the things we did, and please do not be disheartened by the amount of text on this slide. I was thinking more if one of you is, reading the talk afterwards, or, is kind of screenshotting and wants to take notes. But I just wanted to say that before we started the project, we obviously looked at the literature. There's a paper here, links are here in the bottom, paper that we have written, a review on the ecosystem services benefits by urban hedges. And we looked at 45 species and cultivars, and then what traits those species and cultivars have that can be linked with good particulate capture, with good noise reduction, with good rainfall attenuation, with wildlife support, and a few other services. So we were able to kind of generalize and say, okay, so if you want good particular capture in the hedgerow, it looks like what is helping it is large and dense canopy, and here is a descriptor of what we found as a large and dense. The generally shape of a leaf could have an influence, so smaller ovate leaves or hairy leaves or scaly and rough leaves are linked with the better provision of particulate capture. And then examples of species that have these characteristics are here. And then for each of the other services as well, we have the kinds of traits that we've identified, and then species that in the literature have been shown to provide that service. So the information is available as a science paper. So if you just Google, Blanusa hedges, it should come up on Google Scholar. And it's also summarized on the RHS's website for non-technical audiences, basically what it means for your garden and what should you get depending on the issue that you're facing. What we have also looked at in our review are the disservices associated with hedges. There aren't that many, but we have stumbled upon the mention of allergenicity issues, especially with carpinus, fagus, and some evergreens, which in our mind shouldn't mean that we should stop planting those hedges. It's just it means that we need to kind of handle their flowering perhaps slightly differently, or avoid planting them somewhere where you have, you know, a hospital or a school or somewhere where they could cause an issue. And also sort of things to bear in mind are invasiveness and generally intensive management of species, which would reduce the overall positive impact that we found most hedges will have. Sticking with the hedges theme, I just wanted to mention an experiment we did a couple of years ago on several locations in Reading, where I'm based. So we looked at the capture of airborne particulate pollution, so basically dust that's floating about in the air, impact of plant species, and traffic intensity on the position of particles. We've used 3 species, one deciduous, so hawthorn, and then evergreen yew, and we also use cotoneaster, Franchetti, that's Franchet cotoneaster. And we looked at locations of very high, low, and no traffic after a period of dry weather, and we collected some leaf material from hedges which were very close to the road. So like this blue blob is close to one of the sampling sites. You can see it's a 6-lane motorway to Reading. And then we did some leaf washing and determined just through weight filtering and weight determination, we looked at the particle capture. And we found that basically when we had the species with characteristics such as these oval leaves and hairy leaves, there was a drop in concentration at the back of the hedge compared to the front, which we interpreted as this species kind of acting as a filter and the concentration of particles reducing as you go through the hedge. Whereas we found no difference in the concentration of particles back and front in the 2 other species, and they were all planted in a single row right next to the motorway, basically somewhere here. We planted those hedges a year before, so it was a replicated experiment where, you know, the distance from to the pollution source was the same. So yeah, we kind of confirmed that the species impact is occurring, and that possibly for then, in inverted commas, less effective species, perhaps a deeper depth of the hedge would be required to achieve the similar impact. And then when we compared different traffic locations, we had in 3 species, in this case we had a Cuba japonica, hawthorn, and Franchet cotoneaster, that actually this species choice seemed to have mattered most in the major road situation. So there was the biggest difference happened with, you know, when you had high levels of traffic, whereas in the minor road we are losing the significance. However, I mean, there is some slight advantage of the species that has these favorable characteristics, you know, leaf hairs and oval leaves. But it, as I said, it's most important in a very busy traffic location, rather than in a less busy situation. So our less busy situations was just like a dual, like a normal street, or one of our sampling locations was in the middle of University of Reading Botanical Garden, so quite far away from any traffic. And the final bit of my presentation are 2 slides, which are a result from an ongoing current collaboration I have with colleagues at the University of Warwick in the Midlands. My PhD student Letizia Pondini, she's looking at the impact of plant species choice and and traffic intensity on the abundance and diversity of leaf bacterial communities. And the reason she's interested in that is because there's certain type of leaf bacteria which we think can be instrumental in themselves, improving the air quality and breaking down some gaseous pollutants. And basically, so Letizia is looking at various locations, again, less and busy. She's looking at woodland and road and also a campus situation. And she's finding that these locations where she has samplings differ in the amount of pollution. So these are the amounts of particles which she's measuring in those locations, and they differ. And then when she collects from these locations and does the molecular analysis of bacterial diversity, she finds that the bacterial species cluster according to the location, so that she's finding different species on campus as opposed to woodland, as opposed to the road. So that the location, and by correlation also amount of pollution, influences the bacterial composition, leaf bacterial compositions of these locations. And what Letizia has also found is that bacterial abundance was higher in woodland areas compared to other, so the least, there were most bacteria in the least polluted areas, and that was true in different sampling dates over different periods. And where she is taking her work next, so that's something that I will be able to talk to you about, in a year's time, is then how does that pollution that she's measuring affect development of antimicrobial resistance in these populations, which we think could be a significant problem. I mean, what she's hypothesizing is that air pollution is linked with higher development of this antimicrobial resistance, and we think that this might even, have a knock-on effect on sort of human health. So, we think there's something there. We think that, there is this link between bacterial abundance, bacterial diversity, and then how that affects bacterial and also, human health. And, she's continuing to work on this as we speak. So at this point, I'm going to sort of finish and just acknowledge the help of many collaborators in several institutions that I work with, University of Reading, University of Warwick, and clearly my colleagues at the RHS as well. And I have my email there at the bottom if anybody has any questions afterwards. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tijana. That was really good. Good back screen. Yeah, thank you. Can I have my video back? Thanks. Great. And thanks very much. It's a very comprehensive report on the reason why you're doing the work you've done, and the results. That last bit where you say results in a year's time, well, we look forward to hearing about that. Really very interesting. So we'll do a Q&A now. Henrik's going to be joining us, which would be great. Perfect. So we have some questions from the audience, and just following on straight on from your presentation, Tijana, a question that came up was asking about particulate matter on the leaves. So it's all very well that the leaves collect particulate matter, but what when the leaves fall, what happens then? You've answered it to some extent, because the bacterial populations, if I heard you right, do break down some of the particulate matter. But is that a question that the particulate matter is only a pollutant when it's in the air and we breathe? The moment it is trapped by the leaves and falls to the ground and is collected or not, or naturally biodegrades, it's no longer a pollutant?
It is, that's in part, I mean, the main reason why we are worried about particulates is because of their inhalation, and the smaller they are, the more damage they do to us. It also partially depends on what is the composition of those particulates. If that particulate is a heavy metal, then even when it drops to the ground, it is a concern, because then is the question of what happens to it. That's not my area of expertise, and that's something where I'm looking to kind of expand my knowledge myself. But I think part of the science is really just looking at how do we get those particles out from the air and deposit it, and if they're on the ground and stay on the ground, that's fine. And then there's this phytoremediation, is what do you grow on a ground which is partially polluted. How do you then combine it with the plants that maybe can soak up some of those heavy metals that go into the ground, and take it up. But it's not all of the particles are some could be just black carbon, so they don't have necessarily this direct harmful effect when they fall onto the soil.
Okay, good. So it's a combination of removing from the air, but also then looking beyond to phytoremediation, which is another speciality in its own right. There was, I've just posted the DEFRA report, which looks about the position of plants, and you touched on that, Tijana, about street canyons, you don't have a heavy canopy, and the DEFRA report on the impact of vegetation on urban air quality. You can have a look, it does quite a lot of that. So it's about your plant choices, but Henrik, you spoke about a number of aspects that you need to look at for selecting trees specifically. We have a question which is asking about the reintroduction of elms. Obviously, elm disease really reduced a lot of them, and there are some really good selection programs, possibly breeding programs, that are bringing in elms that are tolerant at least. What is your thought about elms? Because they really are lovely in a landscape. They grow really fast, and they create a beautiful canopy.
Yeah. Yes, as you said, there is a lot of, or have been a lot of breeding program, and nowadays we are pretty sure that the Dutch elm disease, as we call it, origin from the Himalayan region there. So we're pretty sure that a lot of these Asian elms have been exposed to this elm disease for many generations, which is the case that a lot of Asian, Chinese and Mongolian and Japanese elms are resistant to elm disease. And special one at Morton Arbory, they picked that up and started to do a breeding program. And they also have a breeding program have been done in Holland, I think, where a lot of this resistant elm have come up. So they are very tough, because some of them have species like Ulmus pumila, which is one of the most hardy tolerant and winter hardy and drought tolerant species we can use, one of the parents. So a lot of these new resistant elms are very tolerant for urban environment, but they have been selecting for street environment mainly. So they have been selected to have a specific canopy growth. So they don't have that much in common when it comes to our native elms with a big mushroom-like canopy. We haven't select towards that, and we should definitely do that, because we need to get the big elm back into the landscape. But the resistant elms as street trees and urban trees are very safe and very good trees, definitely. So yes, there is a future for elms, but you have to work on the ones that are tolerant or even resistant to elm disease. Yes.
Well, that's good news. That's good news. You mentioned breeding. AIPH had participated in a recent webinar looking at plant breeding for a changing climate, and the speaker based in Germany was talking about trees, and pretty much his pitch was that trees are so slow growing that breeding is really slow. So what they're doing a lot is selection. So you're using the natural variation and selecting, and that's really interesting. But it does come back to the question that it goes deeper than the family and deeper than the genus and the species even, as to what we should be looking at planting to deliver our particular benefit. But Tijana, as you say, the multiple benefits that we get. And one example, Tijana, you mentioned Cotoneaster for pollution, which is really great, but that's particularly Cotoneaster franketti. So from my perspective, it's how we get that detailed information to the right people, and how that connects with having the right varieties and even species and even varieties available in production to meet the demand. Either of you have comments about that?
Yeah, I was going to say, just when it comes to Cotoneaster franchati, I think we have to be careful with that, and always think about the local context. I know when we published this paper, we had quite a lot of positive feedback, but then some outrage as to how could we even consider Cotoneaster because it can be invasive in some context, or some other species of that family can be. So we chose it because it's available in the UK. It's popular. It had the traits we wanted because we were trying to prove the point. So if it does, if Cotoneaster doesn't work for you, then I don't know, go for Eliagnus, which also has a hairy underside. But yeah, I also agree with you. I think there is this, how do we get it? I think we are getting there. There's a public appetite for it. I think nurseries themselves are more interested now in, publicizing that environmental benefit of what they're producing. And the garden centers where I've been, I think will be moving towards saying, okay, so yeah, this is the color of the rose, this is the, the management needs, and these are the benefits, you could expect from this hedgerow as opposed to that hedgerow, or maybe even some off-the-shelf solutions where maybe some kind of entrepreneurially minded nurseries would be actually selling, there's a kit, there's your hedgerow if you're on a busy road or a noisy road, or, this is good for biodiversity. But what I'll stop soon, but what I would hopefully hope that our audience don't go away from is trying to fix just one single problem, because yes, if you're on a busy road, that perhaps has to be the thing you're tackling, but in most situations we can try and tick a few more things. So don't be driven just by the fact of, oh, that's the best for air pollution. I mean, pick something that's third for air pollution, but it's also good for cooling, and it's good for biodiversity, and it's good for flooding. So don't be so scared and hang up on just one single indicator. I can see Henrik nodding there.
Yeah, that's great advice. And Henrik, with that, just following on, and you say that you work with nurseries to develop those, both to give them the information, but to make sure that they produce it. Can you just, you've got probably 1 or 2 minutes left, can you just give us your insights as to how you work with plant nurseries to make sure that the production is there?
Yeah, what we do a lot of with the Swedish and Norwegian nursery industry, because we are on the very outskirts of the plant materials capacity to grow when it comes to winter hardiness. We have a addition to that we have to screen. But when it comes to what we do, we try to develop a screening tool in order to screen a simple way so we can screen, for example, drought tolerant. And what we do when we have a collaboration with Botanic Garden, because I think also we need to find the best genetic materials. We have to go on the driest or the coldest area of the species and collect that, bring it home, and do some early evaluation, which we can do on small plants to see the capacity to cope with the specific growing conditions on. And so we collaborate with the nursery industry, because if we can find a more drought tolerant of that species, because what the nursery industry wants to know is what's the market for this plant materials. They want to know. So if we can come up with this genetic materials of the species, can only be a park tree, can also be street tree. They can deliver in all this ecosystem because they have capacity for this, and this. Exactly as Tijana showed that, because the space for tree planting in urban environment is not that enormous. So the few tree planters we get, these plantings need to deliver a multifunctional, they have to be multifunctional. So what we try to do when we try to work with the nursery industry to see what's the capacity delivering all this function and tolerate different growing conditions. And then hopefully the nursery industry see it's a big market for that product. Let's bring it into the production line. And by then it comes out to the market as well. So we need to, I know that for the nursery industry, it's an investment they can't get back for 10 or 13 years. So they now have to know what is in it for them. So the research that Tijana shows, and also the research we do, is very, very important in order to convince the nursery industry to start to produce the species, but also the unique and genetic materials of the species. So that's what I'm doing a lot.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And hopefully webinars like this will help spread the message. That also brings back, you talk about developing systems or protocols to test drought tolerance. Aligns with Tijana saying you're looking at plant traits, and so specific plant traits, and then you adapt those, because you can't test every single plant. But that's really very interesting. Thank you both very, very much for your time and for your expertise. That was really great. Really nice discussion here and very good presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.